Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and good night wherever you are. I see a lot of audience from many places. So welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just running in the background, so I'll give the floor to Dr. Siddharth Chandra, Director of the Asian Studies Center at Michigan State University, to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Thun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Im. And on behalf of everybody at the Asian Studies Center at Michigan State University, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, and also my honor to welcome Dr. Thun, who's going to deliver the talk today. I'll say just a few words about Dr. Thun first, and then maybe for those of you who aren't familiar with his book, say just a few words because I think you're going to hear it in much greater richness and detail from Dr. Thun himself. So Dr. Thun is a visiting scholar at the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. And he's there on a Lee Kong Chian NUS, National University of Singapore, Stanford fellowship at this time. I believe the second part of your fellowship at NUS begins in December.
January.
So his recently published second book in Khmer, co-authored with Yong Kyo and released by the Royal University of Phnom Penh Press, traces the history of Cambodia's ethnic nationalism and violence from the 19th to the 20th centuries. Dr. Thun has also published articles in a number of very prestigious journals in Asian studies, including Critical Asian Studies, the Asian Studies Review, and the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and also a little farther afield from Asian studies in the journal Studies in Higher Education. The title of his book is Epistemology of the Past, Texts, History, and Intellectuals of Cambodia, 1855 to 1970. It's been published again by one of the top presses on Southeast Asian studies in the world, the University of Hawaii Press. It's been out for just a little bit over a year, so it's still fresh. And I could read you a blurb about the book, but perhaps since this is going to be the topic of the webinar, I should thank Dr. Thun for the honor of visiting us and presenting virtually, and also perhaps ask him to tell us more about his book. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Siddharth Chandra, for your kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Im, for your kind invitation. I should have been there at the center in person, but because of my tight schedule, I have flown to different locations within the US. So that's why I cannot make myself go there in person. And such a great honor to be joining you virtually, presenting my book with audience from different parts of the world. Of course, I will talk more about the book, but I want to share my slide. All right. Okay, so I hope you can see my slide. So the topic for this presentation is pretty much the title of the book, Epistemology of the Past, Texts, History, and Intellectuals of Cambodia between 1855 1970. So it's basically based on my PhD thesis, which I submitted to the National University of Singapore under a joint fellowship with the Harvard Engineering Institute. So, I mean, this is how the book looked like. So it's a rather thin book, roughly a little bit more than 150 pages. So it won't take you so much time to read the book. So altogether, it consists of 5 major chapters alongside the introduction and conclusion sections. Again, it was released by the University of Hawaii Press in August 2024. A little bit of the marketing work. So this is the link that you can get to the book with the University of Hawaii Press website. And I also provide the author code, which I think you can get around 30% discount with this code. Another major development is that I keep looking up at the Amazon, and when the book was just released, the price was 61.51 US dollars. But now, maybe because it's holiday season, so the price goes down to 43, a little bit of $43. All right. So let's go to the content of the book. So the title, I put the title here, Epistemology of the Past. So what do I mean by that? It basically refers to the ideas of how knowledge or belief about past events that are formed and evaluated within a given scholarly setting. And when we talk about past event, so usually people refers to the notion of history because history is such a big discipline. And when we talk about history, people talk about Western notion of history. So within the Western notion of history, usually we understand past events through the critical examination of sources, different kinds of materials, written record, interviews, artifacts, and even oral traditions. So the different sources that can combine and turn into historical knowledge. For Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia was colonized by different Western powers, including the French, the British, even the American, the Dutch, the Americans. So, Western scholars play such an important role in constructing knowledge, especially historical knowledge about Southeast Asia. So the person I put into this PowerPoint is George Sedez. George Sedez is probably the founding father of Southeast Asian studies. So he studied extensively different aspects of the region. He had published so many books, so many scholarly works on the region, and particularly Cambodia, because he studied basically, almost all aspects of Cambodian history, focusing on the classical period. So he's famous for producing a series of inscription of Cambodia. So altogether, I think there are like 7 or 8 volumes. And these publications have remained an essential source to study Southeast Asia, especially Cambodian history until now. Not just about Indochina or Cambodia, if you look at the whole region, Professor D.G. Hall, he's very prominent for the aspect of Burmese study. Then we have other, scholars of French colonial government looking at different geographical areas of Indochina, Allemand Leclerc, Aymonier, Louis Finot, and many others, so these white, men individuals basically play a fundamental role in constructing historical knowledge on Southeast Asia. So because of there are many publications, there are many works have done during the colonial era, basically from the 19th and early 20th century. So there is an assumption that the pre-colonial indigenous conception of the past, meaning how indigenous people, wrote their own history, were basically replaced by the Western notion of history during the colonial encounter, basically from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries. But my book kind of give a little bit of different angles of how to look at Southeast Asia, particularly from the aspect of intellectual history. Because when we talk about knowledge produced by colonial scholars, for example, this important book, it has been translated into different languages, including English, and it was written by Sedez in 1944. But the way that Sedez produced this scholarship, it doesn't go directly to the local population, as I put on the other side of the slide. So because it was written in French, so the local people basically cannot read French. So there are somebody in the middle, the middleman. For the Cambodian case, there is a very prominent active translator by the name Nhok Thang. Nhok Tham, he's fluent. He was fluent in French, so he did a lot of translation work from French publications into Khmer, and then it was published by the Buddhist Institute in Phnom Penh. So, but Nhok Tham himself, given that he's a Khmer individual, he actually went to Bangkok to study during his when he was a monk. He grew up in Battambang, so he crossed the border into Bangkok and spent many years studying Thai Buddhism, Thai language, and many other philosophical works in Thailand. And he was influenced by a Thai individual by the name Luang Vichitrakarn. So Luang Vichitrakarn, he was such a prominent Thai intellectual during, I think, before a little bit before World War II and during World War II. And Nhok Tham, as a Cambodian monk studying in Bangkok, he also got a lot of ideas from Thai intellectuals such as Luang Vichitrakarn. So the idea here is not just about the French influence how Southeast Asians view their own history. There's also a very complicated networks within the region. Different local intellectuals, they interacted differently within their peers, within and beyond the region. So there are many other local intellectuals. For example, an individual by the name Chumau. So he didn't even have his own photo. That means he's virtually unknown for modern, among modern Cambodian scholars. So he actually took part as the editor-in-chief of the important magazine by the name Cambodia Saroya, or Cambodian Sun. He was in charge of the magazine between 1926, 1936, and he did a lot of translation work as well. So the idea of to accelerate the flow of colonial knowledge production from the French circle to the Cambodian audience. So it kind of a little bit of focus, the main themes of the book. So basically it looks at the little known figures such as Nhok Tham, Chumau, among many others, who played an important role in the circulation of knowledge during pretty much the early 20th century. At the same time, the book also looks at transition, the evolution of pre-colonial history-making traditions. In Cambodia, it's known to be the chronicle writing of Pong Savada. In Thai, Pong Savadan. So a little bit, different pronunciation, but basically similar scholarly tradition. At the same time, the book also explores a lot of translation work. There are transculturation between Cambodia and its neighboring regions. There are also intellectual networks. So for the book, it looks particularly to the case of the Khmer, the Thai, and the French. So there were very strong connection throughout the 19th and early 20th century. The last part of the book is to explore the emergence of new forms of historical perceptions, not just in Cambodia, but across the region during the critical, decades of colonial and independent Cambodia between the 1900s until the 1970s. So these are the major themes or focuses of the book. Talking about sources, so because when I was doing my PhD, I was lucky to receive different research grants to travel to different parts of the world to collect sources. So basically, the book compiles a very big number of Khmer chronicles. So altogether, the book put 17 original handwritten manuscripts was included and examined in the book. So those chronicles were produced between 1714 until 1969, and they were collected from the Netherlands, Paris, US, Japan, Cambodia, and Thailand. So at the same time, I also use other sources in Khmer, in French. There are scholarly magazine, religious texts, history textbooks, and a vast number of translated texts. The book also made use of popular culture, such as novels, films, documentaries, and classical dance repertoires. So such a variety of sources that has been integrated into this discussion of the book. So when, putting together such a large volume of sources, so I came up with a different angles of conclusion. So for those who assume that maybe the colonial historical thought has replaced the indigenous history-making tradition, so I kind of challenge again this idea a little bit by arguing that maybe it's not entirely true to assume that Western notion of history replaced the pre-colonial indigenous perception of the past. Because when we look at, from an intellectual historical perspective, we are talking about two different schools of thought. So the first one will be the chronicle, something that has existed long time ago, before the arrival of Western colonial power. At the same time, we have the Western historical thought, which came to the region and was adopted by different, individuals within the region from the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So the pre-colonial making practices basically persisted instead of adapting everything from Europe or from the Western world. Alongside Western historical writing, leading to the development of a unique body of knowledge with its own distinct epistemology. Under French colonial encounter, new discourses of Cambodia's national history had emerged by drawing on, reconfiguring, combining, in some cases, even rejecting all the historical discourses held in the pre-colonial historical traditions. So to show you how does this, interactions, how different, two forms of knowledge, they encounter each other. So methodologically speaking, basically I look into the pre-colonial scholarly tradition. Again, it's known to be Bong Savada or Bong Savadan in Laos, in Thailand. In Myanmar, can be different. Remove this one. So the chronicle tradition was practiced mainly by the royal court. That means different rulers, different kings, when they came to power, so they asked their official to write new chronicle for their reign. So alongside the palace, there also Buddhist monasteries had the tradition of producing many chronicle texts. Chronicle texts produced by Buddhist monastery usually combine between stories about the court and also events that happen at the provincial or local levels. To give you a little bit of more understanding about how the chronicle writing works, so basically it was practiced roughly from the 18th century. The chronicle was handwritten document, as you can see in the photo. This is one of the Khmer chronicles produced in 1869. The content of the chronicle is basically about successful rulers, their powers, their wars, their disputes within their family members, the Khmer royal family members. The chronicle text, I'm talking about the physicality of the text. It can also be used in ceremonies, such as the celebration of a new reign or the celebration of a new monastery building. The story of the chronicle is heavily mythical in content. That means there are a lot of stories about superstition, about magical powers, about ghost armies, so there is no distinction between what we now know as fake or fiction. So the chronicle, the history tradition does not make the distinction between these two broad notions. Seems a little bit noisy out here. The voice, is that okay, Sampol?
Yes, we can still hear you very well.
Okay, so because there's somebody doing some construction near my house. Okay, so we're talking about a little bit of comparison here. Western notion of history. So as you can see, usually when you write history, you produce it in print, you publish by certain presses. the content of Western notion history is basically very strongly state-centered rather than merely action of successful rulers. Unlike the chronicle tradition, Western notion of history pay a very critical attention on sources and fragmented facts. More importantly, it does make a clear distinction between what we understand as fact or fiction. So we're talking about general historical historical writings produced by Western colonial power on Southeast Asia. So basically, they have these distinctive features. So different parts of the region, different states, different countries, different societies, they are slightly different experience. For the Cambodian case, when these two schools of historical thought they encounter one another. So in Cambodia, it happened between the 1900 onwards. So on the one hand, we have a long existing local tradition known as the chronicle. On the other side, we have Western historical thought. When the two schools of thought encounter one another, it's not just about how the two ideas clash one another. It's about the diversion, the emergence of different forms of knowledge production on the ground. For the Cambodian case, when there are two school of thought encounter one another, the consequences is happen in different stakeholders, to use the term that we use nowadays. So it appears in novels, it appears in translation work, even filmmaking, historical writing, palace astronomers, court official, monks, even classical dance story writer. So there are, different groups of people. They try to make sense of what's going on because they have their, long tradition, and now they're having something new coming to them. So there are different groups of people they encounter that experience. So to give you a better explanation of what's happening at that time, I kind of categorize these into two major groups. So there are group of scholars. They basically work for the palace. So they continue to produce the chronicle writings, chronicle texts, try to advocate stories in the chronicles. So at the same time, we're talking about local scholars who try to be more progressive, try to promote the idea that perhaps the chronicle writing is no longer valid for this point in time because it doesn't really tell true stories about the past. So those local scholars, they basically work for the Buddhist Institute. So they kind of, we can use the word pro-Western notion of history. So let's look at their story in detail about these two groups of scholars. So the palace. I basically discuss this aspect in chapter 2 of the book. So they basically less receptive to Western or French historical thought. Instead, they actively engage. They continue to produce chronicle texts. Some of them even did translation from Siamese or even from Lao language. There are also chronicles in Khmer about the Cham kingdom or the Cham people. So the chronicle was still very prominent, very popular, even during the time that Western colonial power was in the country. So that means there are people who try to preserve the chronicle tradition. They did so because they believed that the chronicle text constituted the core narrative of the kingdom's past. Why is it so? Because for the larger public, it contains a lot of stories, a lot of collective cultures. That was meaningful for them. There was something that makes sense in their everyday life. Something that is very strong, connected to their religious practices, for example. So the chronicle kind of correspond to those beliefs. As for the Cambodian rulers, especially kings, the chronicle served as something that was very special for them in the promotion of their spiritual power and Buddhist kingship in the regions to encounter French colonial influence. So that's why, they still believe that the chronicle was still something that more favorable compared to French historical writing. So this is an example of how the chronicle was produced in 1934. It was still in handwritten. They intended to print it, but the intention was not successful. So basically, the Cambodian royal palace took efforts to preserve and modify the format, the contents of the chronicle to fit new colonial conditions. So based on my research, because I shown you a lot of sources earlier in the presentation. So from the 1900 onwards, there are at least 7 Palace Chronicle Commission were produced, ranging from 1903 until 1949. And the Cambodian Royal Palace basically continued to produce the Chronicle text until 1949. I'll explain why they stopped after 1949 in the following slides. So basically, throughout the first half of the 20th century, the Cambodian Royal Palace continued to produce chronicle texts, given that French historiography was very prominent at that point in time. So this is the first group, the kind of conservative group. So now we're going to the Buddhist affiliated scholars. So these scholars, basically they're more receptive to Western notion of history. So they did so because many of them, they have worked under French, scholar officials leadership, because the Buddhist Institute was basically in charge by the colonial government until the late 1940s. So that's why those local scholars, they were so in favor of Western historical writing. So among them, there were 3 types of local scholarship that were produced during the first half of the 20th century. So those scholarship basically, they blended interpretation between chronicle scholarship and French historical thought. There were a lot of translation work. Many French scholarship was translated into Khmer and published by the Buddhist Institute. The content of historical writings produced by local scholars affiliated with the Buddhist Institute, they appear to be less religious in content. That means it's become more and more secular sense of historical and cultural worldviews. So it's a way to step up, it's a sign that they are moving away from the traditional historical chronicle writing. So basically, from the mid 1920s, there was an emergence of a new body of knowledge known in Khmer as Prevailing writing. So Prevailing writing is basically the translation of the word history. So it's derived from 2 sources. One is Bali, Pawat, and then Prevailing also has some connection with Thailand, because the term was also used in Thailand since the early 1900s. So you see there's some connection between Buddhism and Thai intellectuals at this point in time as well. So now, by the 1920s, there was a new body of scholarship that was emerging in Cambodia. By the 1940s, Western notion of history, or what is that writing, became established among local scholars and political leaders. Basically, historical writing, following the model of historical thought of the Western world, become a popular source of nationalism and political propaganda. So historical writing about Cambodia basically depicted story about the monarchy, placing particular king at the center of their collective historical understanding. So knowledge production of history basically was employed to position Cambodia as a civilized or powerful country similar to its French colonial counterpart. This was the time that when Cambodia was moving toward independence in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So basically they used historical thought to to promote Cambodia as an independent country. At the same time, when they were so in favor, they were so, moving toward the Western historical thought, there are a lot of scholars on the ground. They actively translated, different texts, different works from Siamese or from French into Khmer. So there was a very strong connection again between these, two neighboring kingdoms. Talking about Nhok Tham, Nhok Tham was the person that I mentioned earlier in the slide. So because he was such a prominent figure during the 1930s and 1940s, so he stood out to criticize the inaccuracy of the pre-colonial historical, chronicle scholarship. So he basically tried to move himself away from the traditional way of writing history. At the same time, he impressed French and Thai historiography very heavily. For example, there was a very famous volume published by Vijay Vatakan in Thailand, known as Universal History, Pabot Sasakan, published in 1929 and 1931. And then Nhok Tham translated those, Thai texts into Khmer and then published in the Cambodia Surya magazine. So what he did basically, displays French, Thai, Khmer transculturation. Even Cambodia was colonized, being colonized by the French during that time, but there were still very strong local networks within different society, different scholars of the region. So there will never be a straightforward division between the West and non-West. Within the local level, things are a little bit more complicated than that. So again, back to the chronicle story, because I mentioned earlier that by 1949, the Cambodian palace no longer interested in, producing any more royal chronicles. So the palace did so because they believed that the Cambodian palace got a new king by the name King Sihanouk. King Sihanouk was trained in Western schools. He was sent to Saigon or Cochin, China for education in French school. So he, of course, he have more interest. He saw the value of French style historical writing more important compared to the traditional chronicle writing. So unlike his predecessors, Sihanouk had been educated in French colonial school, thus more directly influenced by such scholarship. So what happened to the chronicle scholarly tradition if the palace abandoned this, traditional way of writing history? I wrote in chapter 5, tried to give more agency to the local scholarship. So there is a chapter in the book titled Chronicle Epistemology and Authority in the transition to independent. So the chapter basically argues that the chronicle, the traditional way of writing, basically continued to exist, and its contents and scholarly tradition continue to have a significant influence on modern Cambodia's history textbooks, nationalist thought, and even popular culture. That means it didn't go anywhere. This is an example of how the chronicle survived during the mid-20th century. There was the publication of the first history textbooks published by the palace in 1952. And scholars of the palace basically was the one in charge of writing this history textbook. And they included a lot of elements from the chronicle. So the content of the textbook basically display a significant influence of the chronicle scholarly tradition. Even can you see from the title is Bong Savada. It's not Prabodhisas or history, okay? So because the chronicle writing was handwritten, it never been published during the colonial period. So after Cambodia got independent in 1953, there was the first time that different editions, different versions of the Chronicle were published. So between 1950s, the 1950, early 1970, at least there are six 19th and early 20th century Chronicle were published, were printed for the first time. So this was the very first time that they appeared among the local audience in print at length. At least two of them were widely known and become a very popular symbol of anger, antagonism among the Cambodian, nationalists toward the neighbors, because the story was about how the Vietnamese they abused Cambodia during the early 19th century, before the arrival of the French. So the story about war between Cambodia and its neighboring parties or neighboring kingdoms were very prominent, very popular during the post-independent era. So that's why story of the Chronicle was still quite appealing to the local audience, because of contemporary political relationship between these neighboring countries of mainland Southeast Asia. So basically, the Chronicle still existed as an important source of collective memory and national thought throughout the post-independent period. Then there are also new publication of the Chronicle. Given that the palace stopped writing the Chronicle, there are some individual scholars in 1969 by the name Ain Sut. He compiled, different Chronicle editions, put together and then published into a large book. So, and from that point inward, this Chronicle text become one of the most popular history texts in Cambodia even now. So basically, the Chronicle was contained 1,216 pages. It's quite thick book. He wrote a letter to ask permission from the Cambodian government at that time. The Cambodian government approved it to be published 3,500 copies for the population of roughly 6 million, and not many people could read and write at that point. So 3,500 copies was such a big number. So instead of, because it's very thick book, so instead of writing the whole thing, he divided into different, small texts, published it as a long series of 16-page Khmer text arranged in numeral order, altogether consisting of 76 texts, as you can see from the photo here. From that point onward, the Chronicle has remained widely known among the Cambodian public until today. So this is an example of how the Chronicle has been known until today and have been reproduced in different forms, in different instances, including the one in the middle is used as additional material in official school education in Cambodia. So that means in Cambodia now, for the history subject, the Chronicle is part of the official material, because the Ministry of Education adapted this particular Chronicle as additional source for students in secondary school and high school to learn. Okay, why today's book was not so popular, among many local Cambodians? Why this Chronicle was still very appealing to those local people? So one of the reasons is because, again, story in the Chronicle incorporated religious belief, social and cultural value. They were closely related to the daily activities of the larger Cambodian public. Stories such as the founding of Phnom Penh, as you can see the picture below here. It was story in the Chronicle, and people find it so relevant to them. Something to do with Buddhism, the construction of Phnom Penh, the capital city of Cambodia, Another story was the story of how Cambodia and Thailand were in war back to the 16th century. And sadly speaking, we are in war right now. So, because what is going on in the contemporary era, so story in the Chronicle about fighting in the past may be also relevant to what is happening in the prison as well. So that's why people still go back to stories of the Chronicle, even in the 20th and 21st century. popular culture. So the Chronicle did not just about, going to different, to school education, to, something that students learned from the textbook, but also it also spread into popular culture. This is a classical example of how the Chronicle story was, involved in the production of popular culture in Cambodia. So one of the earliest Cambodian rock and roll band was created in 1959, inspired by US and British rock and roll music. The band, interestingly, as you can see from the photo, the band was named after a well-known mythical ruler whose existence is preserved in 19th and early 20th century, known as King Baksay Cham Krong. So the name of the band was known as to be Baksay Cham Krong, a popular name representing a story in the Chronicle. Classical dance. So the palace, after independence, the Cambodian Royal Palace produced around 10 stories of classical dance. So and they always went back to the Chronicle, to produce those story of the dance. So one of them is known to be Prethao Niang Nia, the story that explain how the Cambodian kingdom came into existence. Basically, story of the founding of the Cambodian kingdom. So instead of adapting story from French colonial writing, the Cambodian palace in the 60s went to the story of the Chronicle and then turned it into something, explain the mythical, majestic power of the palace. Another story by the name Praket Melia, the story of the construction of the Angkor temples. I think many of you probably familiar with the temple of Angkor Wat, but in that area, there are so many other temples. And the story of how those temples were constructed was actually originally recounted in the Chronicle. In the 60s, when they created, classical dance repertoire, so they went back to the Chronicle story in order to explain, to have these dancing shows, all the costumes and everything, put into one place. So again, the Chronicle was still very popular even among the court culture. Not just about court culture. There are also Chronicle-based novels and films during the 60s, the early 70s. As you can see in these images, these are novels and films. They're all derived from stories of the Chronicle. Let's step back a little bit from the Cambodian case. Let's go to Thailand. So in Thailand, because Muay Thai is such a very, it's a national sport in Thailand, a very popular one. So a popular novel that was published in 1987, which was inspired by the Thai Chronicle accounts, told story of a successful Thai boxer at the moment after Thailand's ancient royal capital Ayutthaya was captured by the Burmese army in 1767. So the story of how Burma and Thailand was in war. There was a boxer who was very good at, boxing against different Burmese boxers, and he was very famous. His story was basically constructed in 1987. And where did the writer got the story? The writer got the story from Thai Chronicle. So Professor Sunet at Chulalongkorn University explained that the novel itself was not historically accurate, but its content was effectively used to portray negative images of the Burmese by depicting them as monster invader killers of the Thai people. So again, this is how scholars, how the Chronicle enter popular culture in Thailand. Go to Malaysia. Malaysia also has similar pre-colonial, historical writing traditions known to be the Hikayat writing. So the Hikayat was also turned into a popular source of materials for the production of films, novels, and comics of independent Malaysia in the 50s and the 60s as well. Professor Tommy Bernard, professor at the NUS National University of Singapore History Department, he wrote a paper about the murder of Sultan Muhammad II which had previously been recounted in Hikayat accounts during the 19th century. The narrative that was transformed into different, new versions of central events within, the culture of decolonization, the growing of nationalism in Malaysia between the 50s and the 70s. So based on these examples, there are evidence regarding the vital role of pre-colonial and colonial indigenous sources, such as the Chronicle, the Hikayat, and other literary accounts in the construction and stimulation of nationalist thought in societies across Southeast Asia. So as a way to, conclude what I have just presented, so I basically wanted to explain two important things. So the first thing I wanted to draw your attention from the historiographical perspective, through a closer look of the transition of the local intellectual landscape, it becomes clear that the establishment of the Western model of historical writing did not entirely eradicate it or replace or take over the pre-colonial indigenous tradition of recounting past events in different parts of Southeast Asia, including Cambodia. Pre-colonial history-making traditions, which were initially constructed to promote state rulers and religious leaders, continue to be crucial for post-colonial society. So that is the first conclusion. The second one is something that I look from intellectual perspective. So basically, when Southeast Asia, especially Cambodia, encountered the inevitable march of Western colonial influence, there were different categories of scholars on the scene who engaged with both pre-colonial indigenous tradition and European historical conventions in different ways and to different extents. So as for the Cambodian case, there are many, category of scholars. There are many groups of scholars who have different worldviews about what this history was about. But basically, there were people who was less receptive, toward Western historical writing. There are also people who are more receptive, to accepting scholarships produced by Western scholars. So basically, the existence of these different categories of scholars showed that throughout the colonial and post-independent period, there will never be a single template of national historical imagination. That means there are pluralistic perceptions on the ground. Both European and indigenous practices were transformed into unexpected ways of during this period of interaction. There existed the close multi-layers of intellectual traditions and diverse views of indigenous scholars engaging with European scholarly traditions. Perhaps, because of this, diversity, this phenomenon can also be applied to the study of Southeast Asian religions, cultures, politics, and nationalism during the colonial encounter as well. So I'll leave it there and then open the floor for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thun. We have some attendees in the audience as well as people on the panel. Would anybody like to ask any questions? You can, I don't know, Sampas, is there an ability for people to raise hands or should they type into the question into the webinar chat?
I'm not sure if they can raise hand, but they can post questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
Maybe
Okay.
people needs a couple minutes to think through in the meantime while waiting. I do
So-
have some questions myself, actually, or Siddharth, please go ahead.
I do too, but why don't you start, Sampas?
So my question is pretty simple. I just it's at the start of the presentation you mentioned about the French historian George Sedes, who is one of the first or very few early Cambodian history, who study about Indochina and written a lot about Cambodia, but most of his, I mean, all his work is written in French, which is inaccessible to a lot of Cambodian people, especially the new generations who not, most don't learn French anymore. So I was wondering, for you as a scholar, historian of Cambodia, do you have any plan to translate your book into Khmer to make it more accessible to Cambodia, since your book is also written in a foreign language, in English?
So
Then
now
I'll have
repeat
some
the
other follow-up
story,
questions.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's my question, and I'll leave out
Should
this.
I address the question straight away?
Please do.
Okay. So this is a very important question, actually. So right after the book was released by the University of Hawaii Press, I approached the Center for Khmer Studies in Cambodia, asking them whether they can, translate the book into Khmer. And they replied positively that they wanted to translate into Khmer. So they granted me a small budget to do the translation. So basically, I have signed a contract with the Center for Khmer Studies for the translation. We have a translation team in place. I basically oversees all the process, and we have done almost 3 chapters. So basically, by summer next year, the Khmer edition will be available. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Siddharth, please go ahead. And
I don't want to repeat the
the
colonial
audience.
story, so yeah.
Thank you.
So Dr. Thun, I found your presentation fascinating because, I'm originally from India, and I've read a number of histories coming out of India as well. And one thing I've noticed in some of these histories is very often when they talk about people in the present, or they talk about genealogies, let's say, right? The start of the genealogy is in the realm of what I think in Western literature you would call mythology. Okay. So there are, there are gods, there are other types of, characters that, you might not observe around you physically when you walk around today, right?
Yes.
And then, so if that's the start, in the present, by the time you reach the present, pretty much everybody they talk about is somebody who actually physically existed, because your degree of separation is maybe 0 or 1, right?
Yeah.
So they're actually what you might call real people. And so somewhere between that initiation point and the final point, there is a transition, right?
Yes.
And my question to you is, in the case of the chronicles that you are studying or other works that you may have read, is that transition a gradual one or is it an abrupt one? And what does that tell you about the mindset of the people who are writing these books?
So just to clarify, there are different versions of the chronicle. We have 19th century chronicle, 20th century chronicle. They are different in telling stories. So would you like me to answer for the 19th century or the 20th century?
I think it's just generally sort of in the realm of chronicles and telling, histories or stories, right? The Khmer tradition, to the extent that I'm guessing from what I picked up from what you were saying, it is always talking about transitions from the mythological to the real.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
How do those transitions happen? Do they tend to be abrupt or gradual? And what does that tell you about the mindset of the writers?
Okay, thank you. I think it's a very important question, and this question basically touches upon the core of the book. So thank you very much for this, insightful questions. Really, I appreciate the question. So the chronicle, the early part of the chronicle is very mythical or something very abstract. So for many editions of Khmer, Thai, Lao, and I think Burmese chronicle as well. So it links to the story of either the Buddha or the story of God Hindus, one of the Hindu gods, right? So for the case of Cambodia, the story of how the Lord Buddha came to a place which later on became the Cambodian kingdom, right? So in fact, if we judge from our contemporary notion or understanding, the Buddha never come to Southeast Asia physically. But the idea of connecting to Buddha is to show that this kingdom is actually, to show that this kingdom is a Buddhist kingdom, and the story is, connected directly from the story of the Buddha, right? So it serves more like religious purposes than realistic understanding of the past. So usually the earlier part of the chronicles, basically around, let's say 30%, 25% of the earlier parts, they're very mythical in content. I mean, something, it's about real place, but telling story about real places in a mythical way, right? The temple of Angkor, for example, was created by God Indra, something like that. Then when it comes to something that is conflict between polities, between Cambodia, between Thai, between Siamese, between the Vietnamese, between the Laos. So this become more realistic in content. That means because it concerns the kingdom that is now, something that they understood in their contemporary sense, right? So when they started talking about conflicts, interactions among different parties, so those stories tend to be more realistic. But there's still also within the fighting, there's some magical monk out there. There's some 7 day of rain, cloudy day that signs signals of something very bad is going to happen. There's a lot of elements of belief along the way as well. So when it moves toward a very contemporary, something maybe around 200 years within the contemporary range, so because they have more memories of the code of the activities. So basically they try to detail as much as possible about activities of the king. Particular king became monk for a certain period, and then there's some fighting conflict within the family members. So conceptually speaking, when we encounter storytelling in such a way, because Southeast Asia, maybe Cambodia, doesn't have a very strong sense of keeping record. So you only have stone inscriptions, right? You only have a stone inscription that can survive for a long period of time. Books, manuscripts, folded books, they don't last long. That means memory has lost gradually, right? So, but regardless of how much you know about your ancestral past, you wanted to construct certain story, right? So that's why the early part of the story tend to be more imaginative, rather than something that, they can have some records so that they can, copy and readjust, so make things a little bit more obvious. So this is something about my rough interpretation of what happened, why they write story in such a way. But when those chronicle writers, they encounter Western historical thought, because Western historical thought always asks for the notion of truth. So by the notion of truth, that means you need to provide a more detailed time, birthday of the king. If you believe that the king really existed, what was his birthday? Something like that. So 20th century chronicle writers, they was influenced by those criticisms of writing mythical stories. So they tried to superficially constructed the story of the king to become more accurate, with a precise birthday, the day of his funeral, the place where the funeral took place, things like that. So that's why from 1904, 1907 onwards, many elements of the Khmer Palace Chronicle, they are made up stories. So the reason they made up the story, because they wanted to prove that their story was trustworthy. Yeah.
That's very interesting and
Thank you.
insightful.
Yeah.
I wonder if it has something to do with climate as well, because, the climate of Cambodia is not conducive to preserving writing on leaves or other types of media, where if you live in a drier and colder climate,
Yeah.
it may be more conducive to it. But any other questions, anybody?
Our attendees, if you have any questions and if you don't want to type on Q&A, please let me know, and I can also allow you to speak. While we're waiting, I also have one more question, if you're allowed.
You can ask many
I
questions you
actually
like.
haven't, yeah, I have not finished reading your book since I got it from the AAS last year. But I was wondering whether you have encountered any challenge in collecting those historical texts, especially the chronicles, given the fact that Cambodia have experienced a lot of war and conflicts in the 70s and the 80s, or where most of those that you collected were, preserved outside of Cambodia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about the sources, it was actually the most challenging for me throughout the writing process because during my time staying in Cambodia, when I did my undergrad, I didn't know the existence of many sources. So I thought that that chronicle was written in 1969. That was the main text. That was the only chronicle that we got. So I didn't really have a very large understanding of how the circulation of texts or sources have been. I went to Thailand. I heard chronicles about how King Mongkut of Thailand ordered some translation of Khmer Chronicle into Siamese. Cambodian King Ong Duong asked King of Siam to bring back some Buddhist texts back to Cambodia. There was some Cambodian scholars went to study in Thailand, encountered some Khmer texts, and then they brought back, and then they some translation into Khmer. So I kind of get more understandings of how the circulation of sources beyond the Cambodian border. So when I was in Thailand, I collected sources available in the National Library collection of Bangkok. I went to Singapore during my PhD. There are some sources as well. But the more I read, the more I understand that, okay, there are different sources in different parts of the world. One of the sources were available in microfilms in Japan. And I asked my Japanese friend for help. My Japanese friend went to the library and I found out there were a collection of Khmer Chronicles available there in microfilm, and people collected it before the war in 1970. Physically speaking, they don't exist, but they have the version in microfilms. Then I say, okay, can you bring me a copy of the Chronicle? They say no way, because one page is gonna cost something like $5 to get a copy. So it's very difficult to have it. So luckily, I went to Harvard. I talked to the Harvard Engineering Library. The Harvard Engineering Library say, okay, they got connection with the Japanese library, so we will make copy of the microfilm and brought to you in Boston. So I was so fortunate that I got those. So because the adventure of collecting sources was as important as the writing process. So that's why my mobility from one place to another allows me to, enrich myself with, these original manuscript collections. So I'm very proud of that. And I think when the book is written, the Khmer version is available, I think it will help a lot of Cambodians to understand the circulation of their textual culture. Paris has probably the biggest collection of Khmer sources. We're talking about different, large variety of sources. I'm not sure how we're gonna bring those sources back to Cambodia, because in France, not many people actually make use of them, because scholarships in France of their former colonial society is declining, as it happened in anywhere else across the world. So almost nobody have touched those sources. So I'm not sure how it's gonna work. Maybe now they're doing microfilms. That means a lot of people can just get access online. But there are a lot of sources you can spend forever to collect. It will not end at all. So read handwritten writing was so painful because because it's not so similar to our contemporary Khmer script, and so it takes a lot of time. So it was probably one of the more challenges in the writing process about the collection and also about the access to information of those chronicles. Yeah.
Thank you. Siddharth, and our speaker, we have one question from our attendee. Are you able to read it, or are you want me to read it? It's in Q&A box.
Somebody asking about share history of the gender.
Yeah.
What do you think about the current interpretation of the Chabab Sri, the female code of conduct, which people believe that they are the central role in
Yeah,
some
sorry,
form?
if I may read the question
Please,
so
go
that
ahead.
our
Yes.
audience can also hear the questions. So the question reads, can you share about the history of the gender Chabab? What do you think about the current interpretations of what Chabab Sri, Pros, and King Angduang's text? I'm interested in local people's nostalgia for tradition and how this tradition is understood throughout history.
Okay, so this is something entirely different from the story of the book, but because it's part of the pre-colonial history, literary tradition, and I wrote a new paper on this, so I actually got some knowledge to answer this question, even though it doesn't really have to do with the book. So I didn't. This is something that need a lot of background because when we talk about gender equality in Cambodia, scholars usually blame some traditional code of conduct. So in Cambodia, there is a female code of conduct that people believe it has an influential role in determining gender cultures in Cambodia. The female code has been understood as something that place women within their constrained role within the family. They believe that the female code does not encourage girls or female to go to education because the way they teach girls is just to make sure they will do the domestic work. So when people talk about gender in Cambodia, they always refer to that code of conduct because they believe that code of conduct makes Cambodian gender unequal. And it produces in different outcomes, family violence, rape, girl education, skill development, the whole list of everything. But I encountered those women codes of conduct when I did my research on the Chronicle. So because they were produced at about the same time. So those female codes was actually not popular at all in the 19th century. Why it was not so popular? Because it was handwritten. It was handwritten in palm leaf manuscripts, and it was so difficult to read. So that means they could not produce so many copies. So to understand gender culture in Cambodia in the 19th century, you need to study the popular stories. There are a lot of stories about female. And a story about females in 19th century shares some similarity to the rest of Southeast Asia. Females tend to have more role to play. They were intellectual, they were female who were successful business individuals, donors to the temples and everything. So I'm not talking about female was as equal as male in the pre-colonial time, but there are more flexibility. They are not obviously that female was unequal to male because there's no such formula existed in the 19th century in Southeast Asia. This code was actually only well known across the country in the mid-20th century. That means when print culture came in, they published them and they become popular. But how people saw those female code, they didn't see them as something that is practical because it's too confined toward women. So they basically did not view them as something that is applicable to their contemporary right. So among Cambodian intellectuals from the mid 20th century onward, they did not see the female code of conduct as something so applicable to their daily practice. So my conclusion is that this is something that is not as influential as people think. It is just part of a literary culture, something that people encounter in many other stories, other novels. But yeah, we can talk about it more later on.
I think we have a question from Serena too, Siddharth.
Okay.
You wanna read?
So I think Serena is here. Serena, would you like to read the
Yeah,
question
you
out?
may speak as well.
Okay. Hi.
Instead of us reading for you.
Okay.
ahead.
It's very interesting and fascinating presentation. Thank you so
you.
much for sharing your knowledge about Cambodia and Southeast Asia history. So my question is, you mentioned in the presentation that secondary and high school textbooks in Cambodia are based on chronicles instead of Prawatisat or Prawatisat. My question is that whether you see it as a problem, and if that or if it's no, is there a domestic demand to change toward Prawatisat setting?
Good question. Thank you, Serena. I think it's a very important question. Maybe I didn't elaborate clear enough in my presentation. So talking about textbooks after the Khmer Rouge regime 1979, from the 1980s onward, they adopted textbook based on Prawatisat, meaning the Western notion of history. But because local scholars were the one who wrote the textbook, I think the same as in Thailand, right? So local scholars, they tend to be attached to the local tradition than Western, Western intellectuals, those who teaching in American university, for example. So usually local scholars, they were well informed of story in the chronicles. So in the Cambodian case, so the text, the chronicle that I put into the slide, they were used as additional written text. Okay, they are not used as the main textbook itself, only supplementary sources for history education in secondary and high school. But there are many elements. There are many elements of contemporary Cambodian history textbook. They also included story of the chronicle. I can give you a very long list. There's a story, for example, about the abandonment of the Angkor city in the 15th century. They basically incorporated story from the chronicle. There are many historical lessons about wars between Cambodia and its neighboring kingdoms, including the story about the loss of the Mekong Delta. There's a Mekong Delta, now belongs to Vietnam. So those Mekong Delta region used to be part of the Cambodian polity back to the 18th, 17th century. So story of how those territory was lost to the Vietnamese were also recounted in the chronicle, and then contemporary textbook writer, they included, those stories from the chronicle. So even though now they try so hard to follow the Western notion of history, different elements of the pre-colonial historical thought were still there. Chronicle never be, I think it's impossible to completely, remove it from contemporary history education in Cambodia, in Thailand, in Laos, and I think in Myanmar as well. Do I see it as a problem? I see it as a problem in the sense that people don't make the distinction between the two. That means they kind of blend between, Western historical knowledge and historical writing. So by doing so, that means there is not so much agency to the understanding of how the chronicle tradition works. So my intention is actually to, spread the understanding of how traditional historical writing in Southeast Asia operated. So try to explain how the school, the knowledge system itself functioned as opposed to the knowledge system that we imported from the Western world. So that is something that I'm concerned about. That's something that I wanted to, to let school teachers, people on the ground to understand. So when you understand how different, knowledge systems operated, you tend to understand why Chronicle writes story in such a way, right? Why this part should be taken from the Chronicle. You understand, the motivations, the conception, the ideology behind the story. So there's something should be done. I think not just in Cambodia, but in different parts of the region as well. Try to understand more how the traditional knowledge system operated. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Dr. Thun. Any other questions?
I don't see any more from our audience unless you have other follow-up questions, Siddharth. Otherwise, we thank you, Doc. Please go ahead and wrap up.
Okay. So I think on behalf of all of us at Michigan State, but also all our visitors from, I think, a variety of time zones and countries, thank you so much, Dr. Thun, for a very enlightening talk. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
We look forward to your next one. But also, I hope people will be inspired to read the book. I think there are many issues here that are, I think, common throughout not just Southeast Asia, but farther regions in Asia and perhaps globally. I think there is a lot that may be generalizable in
Thank
the
you.
wonderful work that you've done. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you so much
For sharing your time with us.
Thank you so much, Sampor, and thank you everybody for joining from different parts. So see you around and have a good day.
Thank you so much
you.
for your
Okay, bye-bye.
insightful and to everybody who joined us today.